All right, continuing with chapter 10, 1972. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, we talked about relating to Woodstock and the song Ohio, remember, from Kent State. Neil Young was one of the members of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and he was the young in the group, and he continued to sort of be on and off. You know, he would come and go, and sometimes they would record as Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, sometimes just as Crosby, Stills, and Nash. When he recorded on his own, he put out some great music over the years. 1972 was the peak of his commercial success. His album that was a huge hit was called Harvest, and the big hit song from that, Heart of Gold. All right. Also in the early 70s, there was a branch of rock music that really got a lot of focus. Some people called it orchestral rock. It was often called progressive rock. Bands that were examples of this that were very popular were bands like Rush and Yes, and the early days or earlier days of Genesis. Some of Pink Floyd fit into this, and these were bands that they had lyrical passages, absolutely, but progressive rock tended to be a lot of symphonic instruments, a lot of electronic instruments, and a lot of long extended instrumental passages. And so the vocals kind of took the back seat in a lot of ways, not exclusively, but these long instrumental passages and were sort of the hallmark. Um, Again, some of Pink Floyd, but definitely Yes was a progressive rock, orchestral rock band. This song of theirs from '72 was an early hit, and this is called Roundabout from the album. I never remember. Is it Fragile or Not Fragile? I'll look it up. Roundabout, yes. Yes, I love that song. Roundabout. The album is Fragile, by the way. And Pink Floyd, another example of a progressive rock band, although they were they had enough of a connection to sort of roots rock, folk, more of a folk style, and they also had just sort of straight up rock and roll, more in the not Led Zeppelin vein exactly, but Pink Floyd was a straight up rock and roll band in a lot of ways. So, but they definitely veered toward progressive rock at certain points in their career. They had some huge albums over the course of their career, but one of the biggest was an album called Dark Side of the Moon. And Dark Side of the Moon was released, and it spent 700 and I think it was 714 weeks on the chart. So some quick maths. It was around 15 years, give or take, 14, 15 years, that Dark Side of the Moon was on the album chart. So if you think of that, it came out in 72 and it didn't fall off the chart until 1987. So that was extraordinary. And in all the time that Dark Side of the Moon was on the chart, um, one single was released from the album, and the single was called Money. Did very well on the chart. Wasn't a huge hit, but the lone single from Dark Side of the Moon. Let's take a listen to Money by Pink Floyd. Money, Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. Great album. It's the one with the light that goes through the prism and then shoots out. You've seen it. All right. What else? Oh, 72. Exile on Main Street. EXILE on Main Street. Rolling Stones. They're still around. The Beatles have split up, but the Stones in the early and mid 70s, just as big as ever. Exile on Main Street is widely considered to be the Stones' best album. Many critics put Exile on Main Street at the top of the list. It holds up, to be sure. From 72, this is the Stones and Tumbling Dice. All right, Rolling Stones, Tumbling Dice from the 1972 album Exile on Main Street, widely regarded as one of the finest Stones albums of their entire career. Okay, now story songs. We've talked about them in class. They are songs that basically tell a tale from beginning to end. And in the early 1970s to the mid 1970s, I'm not entirely sure why, but there was a trend of story songs. Songs that either told a story specifically, like along a timeline, or it would take chunks of time and show people or things progressing during those times. You take songs like Bad Leroy Brown. Um, Bad Leroy Brown was a huge song in '73 for a singer named Jim Croce, and it was all about a guy who it told the story of this bad guy who got taken out in a bar fight. There were tons, though, of story songs. In going through and just picking, I picked, a couple of the best ones. Harry Chapin, great singer-songwriter from New York, and he had some hits in his career, but nothing came close to Cats in the Cradle, one of the great early to mid 70s story songs from 73, 74, Harry Chapin. Great tune. Great tune. It's been remade a few different times. Another story song from that era, 1974. Billy Joel would go on to become one of the biggest artists of the 70s and 80s. And even into the 90s, his career was huge. And Piano Man was the song that really started it off for him. The song was not huge when it came out. It hit the top 40, but not by much. It sort of peaked around 35. I don't remember exactly. But, the song, as they say, had legs. Because if there is one Billy Joel song that even now, 45 years later, still gets airplay, it's Piano Man. This is Billy Joel. Piano Man, Billy Joel, great song. Steely Dan, a band who uh, debuted in the early 70s. Steely Dan was really a duo, was made up of two guys, um, Walter Fagan and Donald Fagan and Walter Becker. And they were the core of Steely Dan, and they had studio musicians who would sort of come and go depending on the project. Michael McDonald, who would garner fame as the lead singer of the Doobie Brothers, did a lot of studio work with Steely Dan. Reelin' in the Years was one of their big early hits. Let's take a listen. Steely Dan, Reelin' in the Years, great song. And I wanted to play Kid Charlemagne because Kid Charlemagne was a great Steely Dan song. It wasn't a huge hit, but it was a well known song for Steely Dan fans. And might be a well known song for some of you. Kanye West took the song and used it very prominently, not just the song, but the actual recording of Steely Dan in his song Champion. He did it legally, but the Kid Charlemagne came back big time in the guise of Kanye West. Just goes to show songs have different life cycles. So here's some Kid Charlemagne. Give it a listen. It's good stuff. Kid Charlemagne, Steely Dan, and Kanye did a good job of incorporating that song into his song Champion. The Boston band Aerosmith, simply one of the great straight ahead rock and roll bands, and talk about influential um, bands, as all over the place, from Van Halen and the Cars in the late 70s to um, other bands through the 80s, but a lot of bands in the 90s, man, from Pearl Jam and Nirvana to Soundgarden. They really owe a nod Aerosmith's way. Aerosmith took a lot of what bands like Led Zeppelin were doing, and they kind of fused it a little bit with what bands with like Lynyrd Skynyrd were doing, and they put it out there. And their music, Aerosmith's music, became popular. It became mainstream. I mean, bands like Journey wouldn't have existed had it not been for Aerosmith. So, um, great Boston band. Sweet Emotion, one of the early songs from Aerosmith's catalog. Great tune, great tune. Just guitar driven rock and roll that was safe enough for radio, but it was edgy enough to have credibility. Aerosmith did it well. Sweet Emotion. Dream On was an amazing ballad. Aerosmith, they recorded this song a couple years actually before it. They recorded it, released it as a single. It didn't do much. Came back a couple years later and was Aerosmith's first top 10 hit. Dream On. The following year, Aerosmith wound up in the top 10 again with Walk This Way. Come on. As guitar riffs go, there are a few things better. It came back with a version with Run DMC a few years later, but the original holds up, man. Walk This Way. Walk This Way, Aerosmith. All right, that's it for Wednesday's video. Friday, we we go through and we talk about glam rock mostly. Yep. All right. Have a good one. I'll see you on the other side.